Okay, now on to the superphylum Lophotrochozoa. The Lophotrochozoa is, we can call it the non-molting protostomes because, well, they don't molt. And other than that, it is a good, well-supported monophyletic superphylum. If we look at the DNA, and a good question is, well, what unites all of these kind of organisms other than they don't molt? Because we know that if we unite uh, organisms or we form taxa based on structures they lack, such as the ability to molt, they don't really hold up. So Dr. Halanich here at Auburn and his colleagues came up with, they looked at the biology of these organisms to try and figure out what unites them. And the name Lophotrochozoa sort of implies that all of these organisms possess either a lophophore, which is a type of feeding structure that I'll show you in a little bit, or a trochophore larva. So the Lophotrochozoa, these are all protostome animals in their development that have either a lophophore or a trochophore larva. So lophophore isn't the larva. The lophophore is a different type of structure, but the trochophore is a type of larva. Okay, so these are mostly eucoelomate. And we've got several phyla to talk about. Our first phylum is the Rotifera, or the rotifers. And that name means wheel bearer, like rotation. Think about something that rotates. And the wheels that they bear are not actually spinning. They appear to spin because you've got cilia that are beating in such a way that it looks like they're spinning, and that's called metachronal synchrony. And those structures are actually called the corona. You can see here the corona of rotifers varies quite a bit. But I'm going to show you a movie in a second here where you can see the corona with the cilia beating, and that generates a current that enables the rotifer to eat through its modified pharynx, which is called a mastax. All right, so we're going to see that right here in just a second. Let's see. Hopefully this is going to work. Oh, here we go. All right, you see it? Ooh, yeah. This is a picture I actually took in the lab with the protists. These rotifers were actually not supposed to be there, but fortunately for us, for this point in the semester, look at those currents. You can see the corona spinning around and around. The mastax is down in here, that modified pharynx. So these creatures are very small as animals go, microscopic. Oh, you can see it pull its corona in there. But they are eucoelomate, and they are truly animals. So I think we have another one here. That's just a still from the photo to show you that we've got the corona, the two wheels here, and in between them is where we would find the mastax. Now, rotifers are interesting to scientists, not just for their structure, but one group of rotifers, the deloid rotifers. If you want to look up deloid rotifers, shouldn't be hard to Google them up once you get started, because if you type in the letters B and then D, which is how we start deloid, B-D-E-L-L-O-I-D, it's going to take you right to a story about the deloid rotifers and the fact that they have apparently not had sexual recombination for a very, very long time, like hundreds of millions of years, a completely asexual lineage. And typically that's thought to be not a good practice, not a best practice for organisms that require natural selection and have to remain competitive within their environment. But somehow they have done it. Our second phylum of Lophotrochozoa are the Gastrotricha. And Gastrotricha means hair belly. This is another group of mainly aquatic, microscopic organisms that are a bit more worm-like, and they do have something more akin to a head, and they are motile. And they're covered with the cilia, which is how they get that name, hair belly. So, like I said, they are microscopic. They're kind of worm-like. There are about 1,000, fewer than 1,000 species of these things known, somewhere between 450 and 700 species total. So not a very big phylum, but it's out there. And you can see that just like with our rotifers, it might be microscopic, but it doesn't mean it's simple. It's got all of these different types of structures. It's got a mouth. It's got these scales, a pharynx or a throat, these spines on the outside. It's got a digestive tract and a reproductive system, and a complete gut. Mouth at one end, anus at the other. This brings us to our third phylum of lophotrochozoa. These are the Annelida, or the annelid worms. And annelids are segmented worms in general. You may have heard of annelids because earthworms, like this guy down here, this red wiggler, is an annelid. And the name Annelida means little rings. Because of the segmentation of these worms. And you can see that the external anatomy, based on these little rings, suggests that the internal anatomy is based on repetition of units. And these units are called somites. And not only are the somites repeated, but many of the units are actually repeated in several of these somites. So you may have heard you may have heard upon a time that earthworms have 5 hearts. They have 5 aortic arches that pump the blood through their body that are found towards the more anterior region. And then you've got other structures like the metanephridia that are kidney-like in function that are repeated in each unit. So they do have a true coelom, so the gut of an earthworm is completely lined with mesoderm, and all the other organs are lined with peritoneum. And you have different jobs within different segments. So it's not that every segment is doing the exact same thing. It's not like strobilization that we saw in the Scyphistoma of the moon jelly, or the strobilization within a tapeworm. And it's a little bit different. And as I was mentioning, they do have an excretory system that's fairly sophisticated, with a pair of nephridia in each segment. And these nephridia can function to cleanse wastes out of the circulatory system of the earthworm. So in this image, we can see that earthworms have both longitudinal muscle, which is internal to the circular muscle, which is internal to the cuticle, or the outer skin. We can also see here that they've got an intestine, a complete gut with a mouth at one end and an anus at the other. It's important that the anus is at the very end of the worm. It's not they do have what we consider to be a tail region, but the anus is at the very end of it. So in vertebrates, we know that they have a post-anal tail, or a tail that extends beyond the anus, but that's certainly not true in earthworms. You can also see in our representative annelid here that it's got lots of these bristly-looking things, and those are the setae, or some people call them chaetae. And earthworms have relatively few of them, but some of the annelids have a lot of them, and some of them don't have them at all. But the chaetae help them to move through the soil. So they use their circular and longitudinal muscles and their chaetae to move through the soil. They can extend the chaetae, which anchors them in place, and then they can tighten the circular muscle. And when you tighten the circular muscle, it's like squeezing down on a circle, which if you imagine you had a balloon in your hand, or if you cinched up your belt and tightened it, what would that do to you? That would make you straighten up and elongate. So you'd get skinnier and you'd also get longer. Okay? So they can extend their kete out and anchor them in place from the hind end. And they can sort of reach long by squeezing those circular muscles and extend the kete in the front and retract the kete in the back, and then they can squeeze the longitudinal muscles. Remember, the longitudinal muscles, they go along the length of the organism, and when they contract, it's going to pull the tail towards the head. And then they can extend the rear kete again and squeeze the circular muscles, and that's going to make them long and skinny again and push them forward. And so through this extending, anchoring, and pulling themselves through the soil, that's how they get around. So a lot of stuff going on. A fairly sophisticated creature is an earthworm. So we've got 3 classes of annelids. They're not all earthworms to consider. The polychaetes are ones that have lots and lots of chaetae, or setae, these bristle-like structures. Many of them have a distinct head region, which has some sensory organs. They have antennae for chemosensation, and they may have simple eyes, so they can sense light and dark. Many of them have parapodia, which are kind of like the microtrichs in tapeworms, but these are lateral appendages that they use to help them move around and exchange gases and also to feed. We can also classify polychaetes as whether they move around a lot or they don't. If they don't, we consider them to be sedentary, and they pretty much live out their lives in one location in the ocean. And if they are errant, they are able to move around. So a couple of examples of sedentary polychaetes. Here's the feather duster worm. The feather duster worm is found at the bottom of the ocean, and it has, these structures are all surrounding its mouth, and they're called radioles. Radioles, R-A-D-I-O-L-E-S. And the radioles help filter feed, bring food down to the mouth at the anterior end of the organism. And they spend their entire lives living within these leathery tubes at the bottom of the ocean. The lugworm is another marine worm. Some people may have used this for, in the class, may have used this for bait before. You go to the beach and dig these things up. And the way that you find them is you look for these piles of castings. This is, well, it's basically worm poop. So a lugworm lives in this U-shaped burrow, and they have a head end and they have a tail end. So they will come out of this the head end, and they will feed on little bits of detritus in the sand. And when they excrete it, when they poop it out at the other end, the castings kind of look like little cylinders or tubes of, or toothpaste-like sand. So that's kind of how you find a lugworm. You can see it's got lots of bristles on it, which is what makes it a polychaete. But they don't really, I mean, they move a little bit in their burrow, but they don't, once they form a burrow, that's kind of it. For our errant polychaetes, we saw this guy in lab, and you probably saw it, and you're like, what on earth is that? And you keyed it out as an invertebrate, and hopefully if you keyed it out correctly, you found that yes, indeed, it is an annelid. You've got this very clear segmentation, especially on the ventral part. And on the dorsal part, you can see lots of these bristles that help it to move around. Another errant polychaete are palolo worms. And here you can see a whole bunch of the epitopes of palolo worms. Palolo worms are a very prized foodstuff in parts of the South Pacific, like Samoa and the Solomon Islands. These palolo worms have a synchrony of gamete production. And the synchrony of gamete productions mean every year around the same time, by the light of the moon, they will release their gametes in these segments of their bodies. And in places like Samoa and the Solomon Islands, people go out on these moonlit nights and they collect them. They collect these epitokes and eat them up. And they're a good source of protein and fat, so it may sound kind of gross to us, but it's a good source of nutrition. So here you can see when the eggs and sperm are released, they will form a trochophore larva amongst the plankton, which will develop into adults, and the adults live in coral reefs. And then once a year, on a couple of nights, they will release lots and lots of these epitokes, they're called, for people to collect. And if they don't collect them all, enough get by that they can they can keep the population going. So how do they do this? How do they survive this? Well, like other organisms that we've seen, they have strobilization going on, or repetition of a repeating unit. And we call that, in the palolo worms, epitoky. So the most anterior region, or the head-like region, is called the atoke. So here's our atoke up here. And then posterior to it is the epitoke. And this thing back here is full of gametes. And palolo worms and many annelids are actually hermaphroditic, so they produce both eggs and sperm. But the synchronous release of these epitokes means that there's potential for cross-fertilization, and also potential for a feast. So